Hi guys, I decided that I was going to miss you guys so much being out today that I really wanted to feel like I was there with you, and I really wanted you to feel like I was there with you too. So today we're going to do something that's probably a little different than you've ever done before. You guys are going to be listening to some information about the early civilizations of Africa. We haven't really gotten into Africa very much yet. So here's the deal for today. I am going to be talking to you just like I were if I were there. Here's what that means. You need to act like I am in front of the room talking to you. You should have a note sheet given to you by the sub, which is fill in the blank. So it's really easy to follow through with the PowerPoint. You don't have to write everything down because most of the work is done for you. You're welcome for that, by the way. This also means that while I am talking, while the video is playing, you should not be talking to each other. You should not be messing around in class. You should not be doing other things. You definitely shouldn't be on these. Go ahead and put it away. You know who you are. So, please make sure you're paying extra close attention. This is just a great way that we can make sure that we stay caught up while they're peeling skin off of my hand today. Trust me, I'd much rather be there with you. So, without any further ado, here we go with talking about the civilizations of Africa. So you may have noticed we haven't really talked a lot about Africa here and there's in this class, and there's really one main reason for that. Africa is not a continent that has a lot of written history. So most of Africa's history is prehistory, remember the time before written records. So really we have to depend a lot more on oral accounts and oral sources, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But the first thing I want to do is just kind of remind you about the continent of Africa itself in terms of geography. So when you look at a map of Africa, sometimes it looks kind of small, about the same size as South America. But that's really not true. Africa is the second largest continent in the world, second only to Asia. And if you look at this picture here, you can see that you can get a lot of land from other continents inside Africa. United States, India, Europe, Argentina, New Zealand, China. These are all big countries that they have squeezed inside of Africa with room to spare. In addition, Africa houses about 10% of the world's population. There's about 7 billion people in the world, so just kind of think about that. Obviously, you know I can't do the math in my head, but you can try it. So Africa is really big, which is something I think that we actually tend to forget. And part of that has to do with how Africa's history has been kept, which again, we'll talk more about in a second. Now, in terms of the environment of Africa, Africa is very diverse in terms of its environment. There's a lot of different environments. Desert, Sahara, savanna, coastal areas, rainforest. And mostly what you probably think of with Africa is that desert is kind of the most common thought of. Desert is taking over a lot of the environment of Africa, which is really sad. It's getting to be that there's more and more desert every year. But I also think it's important to remember that there's a lot of rainforest in Africa as well. We don't typically associate Africa and rainforest, but that dark green shade of the map there, that's all rainforest. And the desert and the rainforest are pretty much uninhabitable by humans. So that really cuts back on where that humans can live inside Africa. Most people do live in the savannas, which is the light green area. And if you look at that on this map, that's not a huge portion of Africa. So think about the fact that 10% of the world's population, several thousand people, are living in just that pretty small part of the continent. Should kind of give you an idea of the crowding in Africa and how hard it is. Another thing that's really indigenous to Africa are disease-based from insects. So insects are really, really disease prone. The insects that are probably the most common diseases in Africa, that give us the most common diseases in Africa, are the tsetse fly and the mosquito. So the mosquito carry diseases like malaria, which can be treated, but you have to have the medicine, which a lot of times you don't have in Africa. The tsetse fly, you've probably heard of before, carries a disease called sleeping sickness that kills a lot of people and a lot of animals, a lot of the herding animals like cattle in Africa. So these are just kind of some things that you have to be on the lookout for when you're on the continent of Africa. And as I said a minute ago, one of the hardest parts about understanding African history is that it wasn't written down, okay? The other hard part about that is most historians kind of depend on written sources, and let's be honest, most historians are white. So the problem with a lot of Africa's history is that there was a lot of racism involved in Africa's history, especially when it came to understanding those ancient civilizations. And without those written records, white historians of the 1700s and the 1600s and the 1800s were really able to kind of twist the facts to make it seem like white people were really the ones that were in charge of Africa's history. They didn't really think that the Africans were civilized enough to have such sophisticated history. And I really want you to keep that in mind as we're talking about this today, because I think that you'll find that that's not necessarily true in African history. So, let's go ahead and get started. So the emergence of civilization, obviously, as we talked about in the beginning of class, civilization began in Africa. So the very earliest human beings, the earliest bones that we've got of human beings and skeletons came from Africa. Now, in terms of the land itself, the Sahara is kind of the great divide between the northern African civilizations like Egypt, which are a little bit more western, and the southern African civilizations, which are a little bit more distinct. So that divide there, because you can't cross the Sahara. So northern Africa is very different from southern Africa, and that's something to think about. So most of early Africans were nomadic, and nomadic means they moved around, remember? And most of them were herders, not hunter-gatherers. So what that means is they had cattle and sheep and goats and other sort of herding animals that they would move around. The animals need more food, more grasses. Once they eat it all up, the animals can't survive. Cattle was very important to early Africans. It actually was a form of currency for a lot of early Africans. The earliest form of migration was from a group of people called the Bantus. So the Bantus came out of East Africa, and they moved down in to the rest of the Sahara or the savanna of Africa. And with them, they brought their farming, ironworking, and their language. Most African languages today have their root in Bantu languages, and you'll hear that term a lot in terms of African culture and history. So in terms of the culture of Africa, the family is the essential social unit. People live with their families for the rest of their lives. Even after they get married, they're still living in that extended family. The clan is so important because those are the people who are looking out for you and protecting you, especially in such a harsh environment like Africa is. So the family is very important to African communities. And you'll find that people will live in the same general area with their whole family. When they get married, they'll live with their in-laws and their cousins and their sisters and their husbands and wives. So the family becomes really, really important. Now, in terms of the religion of Africa, early African religions is what we call animistic religion. And I mentioned this at the beginning of the year. You probably don't remember. That's okay. I'm going to explain it again. So animistic religions don't really have specific gods and goddesses the way some of the major religions do, like Hinduism or Christianity. Instead, it's a very spiritual religion. You kind of have this sense that there are spirits that surround you and surround the environment. There's also a lot of ancestor worship that's based in animistic religions. So the spirits of the people who have died are able to kind of guide and influence, and a lot of times cause a lot of mischief and havoc. There's a lot of fear that can come into these religions. So that's a big part of what this was all about. Now, as I said a second ago, the problem with African history is that it wasn't written down. That doesn't mean it wasn't kept. And what I mean by this is part of African culture is something called a griot. A griot, like the guy in the picture that you see there, is a specialized storyteller. So his job is to learn the stories of his society and of his culture. So I kind of like to think about it this like the book The Giver, which I bet a lot of you read in middle school. So you've got the guy in The Giver, spoiler alert, whose job is to take the memories of the society, right? Griots kind of do that, except what they're doing is they're learning the stories of their society. So they're learning about the kings that came before, battles, important events that happened to those people. And they learn these stories in a way that is very eloquent, and they can pass those stories on to the future generations. You sit around at night when you've got nothing else to do, you're trying to avoid a lion attack, and the griot is going to tell stories, and this is how you learn your history. And the really important thing to get here is this is what those white historians took and said, this isn't real history, these are just stories. But in a matter of fact, they actually are the history. It just wasn't written down. It was just preserved in a different way. So we've come to understand that even if the stories are embellished a little bit, even if there's some supernatural elements that are probably not historical, the basis of a lot of these stories are the history of those people. And that's how most of this is preserved. And I really think that's important for you to remember, okay? Oral history by these specialized storytellers is how we have this preserved African history, okay? Remember that. Oral history. So I want to take kind of each part of Africa and break it down by north, south, east, and west. So that's what we're going to do. Please don't forget about the Bantu migration. You can kind of see from this map here where all of the different ironworks sites are. You can, again, remember the language is what's used to spread across the continent. So that kind of is the beginning of these civilizations. So think about that as you're listening to each of these groups here. So let's start in North Africa. We've talked a lot about Egypt, so we're not going to talk about Egypt. Instead, we're going to talk about a civilization called Axium. You've probably not heard of it before, and that's okay. Axium was a really rich trading site. It's right on the Horn of Africa, so that kind of piece that juts out a little bit there in the Mediterranean. And remember, it's on the Mediterranean, so that should tell you that they are good traders because they're on that highway of the ancient world. One of the really unique things about Axium is that Christianity gets to Axium pretty early. They follow a form of Christianity called Coptic Christianity. And it begins in the civilization when one of their kings, a guy named Ezana, converts to Christianity. Coptic Christianity is a little different because what it does is it mixes those Christian beliefs of Jesus and God, monotheism, but it blends it with African traditions. So the services are very African. The songs sound very African. There's not a lot of European influence other than those basic beliefs of Christianity, and I'll show you some pictures of that in just a second. So after Coptic Christianity really takes hold here, that kind of makes Axium a little bit more civilized in the eyes of Europeans because they're Christians. That's one of those things that they said about Africans is that they're not civilized because they're not Christians, right? Remember, Europe is Christian in this time period. So this becomes really important to these people, and they survived for a really long time, kind of left alone by the rest of Europe. In fact, some of the most famous Christian leaders of the church come out of this civilization. However, Islam moves into Africa and invaders come into this place and take over this empire after a couple thousand years, and it does fall to them. However, it still survives in some ways today, probably just not in the way you would think. Axium is modern-day Ethiopia, and a lot of the sites that were founded in this ancient time, such as the tomb of King Ezana and some of the obelisks that he built, obelisks are big, tall structures, I'm going to show you a picture in just a sec, they're all still there. So we still get to study it a lot. Also because it converted to Christianity, there are a little bit more written records there, which helps. So again, just show you some pictures here. This is one of the obelisks at Ezana's royal tomb. So you can see the design on it there. Right here, this is a church in one part of it. And you'll notice it doesn't really look a lot like a church. You'll notice it just looks like a giant pillar of a cross sticking out. Just to kind of see what it looks like from the front, you can see that it is actually a building down in this pit. You'll also notice that Coptic priests look a lot different than what you would think of as a Catholic priest, right? So you can really see that African influence in the style of dress and the style of the building in the church in Ethiopia. Now moving on to West Africa. West Africa was really influenced by the expansion of Islam. In fact, once Islam comes into West Africa, Arabic becomes the main language of this part of Africa. The first kingdom that gets really big there is the kingdom of Ghana. Ghana is incredibly wealthy. In fact, it translates into land of gold. So that should give you a good idea about Ghana right there. They got wealthy on the gold and salt trade. So that may seem kind of a weird trade, right? Gold and salt, you don't really think of those two things as going together. One's luxury, one's a seasoning. But think about that seasoning. Think about how important that is. Think about what you use salt for, right? So yeah, it's a seasoning. It makes food taste good. Let's be honest. I couldn't eat without salt. I love my sodium. But it also helps preserve food. Africa's really hot. Food can go bad very quickly. So salt is really good at preserving that food. Also, the human body needs salt. When you sweat, you are sweating salt. So you need to replenish that salt in your body. You can actually die from a lack of salt in your body. So salt's really kind of important. So they had gold. They're trading for salt. They get pretty wealthy from that. It's important to note that at first the kings don't actually convert to Islam, just the people of Ghana. And this is going to cause a lot of problems because the kings are not worshiping the same religion that the people are. And so there's kind of going to be a disconnect there. Eventually, that's going to lead to a kingdom being able to come in and take over, and that was the kingdom of Mali. So Mali also gets their wealth from the gold trade, and eventually they do conquer Ghana from that. There's a lot of really important leaders that we know about from Mali, but the most important is a guy named Mansa Musa. So Mansa Musa was a Muslim, and he was a very, very devout Muslim. And you may remember one of those 5 pillars of Islam is going on a pilgrimage to Mecca, the city where Muhammad was born. So Mansa Musa decides that he's going to take that Hajj, that pilgrimage. And so he packs up his bags, packs up his court, lots of camels, lots of people, brings a lot of money with him, and he starts traveling up from Ghana into northern Africa and eventually into the Middle East. While he's going, he is spreading the wealth, baby. He's making it rain up in Africa. In fact, in Egypt, he spends so much money, he crashes the Egyptian economy. That's huge, guys, like really big. But probably the most important thing he did is while he was out traveling, he kind of made a little collection, and not a little collection of souvenirs and trinkets. He collected scholars. So he brought back people who had been studying the ancient Greek texts and studying mathematics and medicine and science, and he brings them back with him to Mali, and he establishes Africa's first university in the city of Timbuktu. Yes, Timbuktu is a real city. But he builds this university in Timbuktu and really allows for learning to spread and preserves a lot of learning. That's a big deal. Mali stays really wealthy and really powerful for a long time. They do eventually get overtaken by another empire called the Songhai. Songhai was a military state. It was built by a guy named Sunni Ali, and he builds this vast military state, expands his empire, conquers Mali and a lot of the other West African kingdoms, and Songhai stays in power for about 1,000 years. That's a really long time. That's a long empire, longer than Rome. Hello. But the problem is Songhai lacks a lot of modern weapons. They're using very traditional African weapons. So in 1591, jumping a little ahead here, but in 1591, a lot of Arabs from Morocco come in and they do fall to the Moroccans. But still a very long-lasting empire. So these West African kingdoms, the thing you really get from this here is that they are wealthy and they are powerful, and that really goes against this racist view of Africans as being this uncivilized group that a lot of those early historians had. So this kind of goes against that stereotype of Africa. Just some pictures here for you. So you can see here the gold salt trade. You can see Ghana and Mali and Songhai. Benin and Hausa are another cultures. They have the gold. They're trading up north with salt with a group called the Berbers. They're an Arabic group up in the northern part of Africa. So that's where the gold salt trade comes in. A lot of golden artifacts are found in Ghana. Today it's known as the Gold Coast and the Ivory Coast there. And just to give you a good idea, forgot about this. Here we see how salt is transported. You don't really think of salt that can be put into compact packages like this, but these white things in that picture to the right, that's salt. Basically, it just can be compacted together in order to travel much easier, and they would put it on camels, as you can see. So anyway, there is this quote from a geographer, a Muslim geographer who visited the kingdom of Ghana, and he really describes the wealth there. So just to give you an idea, I'm going to read this to you and just want you to think about what you're hearing and what he's seeing there. So the king of Ghana wears necklaces round his neck and bracelets on his forearms. He puts on a high cap decorated with gold and wrapped in a turban of fine cotton. He meets people in a domed pavilion around which stand 10 horses covered with gold-embroidered materials, and on his right are the sons of lesser kings of his country, wearing splendid garments, and their hair is plaited with gold, so braided with gold. At the door of the pavilions are dogs of excellent pedigree. Round their necks they wear collars of gold and silver, studded with a number of balls of the same material. Just take that in for a second. Imagine what it would be like to see this. You know I love my dog. I don't give my dog a collar of gold. I don't give horses blankets embroidered with gold materials. The fact that you're doing that really should indicate something about how much gold they actually have and how much wealth they have that they can spend it on things like that. So that gives you a really good picture of how wealthy Ghana was. And eventually that wealth is going to go into Mana and Songhai and these other cultures. So again, Mali here, you can see where Timbuktu is located. Timbuktu actually translates into heavenly clay. This is a picture of one of the buildings that was built by Mansa Musa in Timbuktu. This is the rooftop. You can see the mosque there again, very intricate, very detailed. He brought, again, sculptors, all that sort of architects back with him. This is another one of the great mosques built in Mali. And then, of course, this is a picture of the voyage that Mansa Musa takes. It's the map that he takes there. So you can see him down at the bottom. He's the one on the right with the green and the gold crown on. You can see that he's pictured with a lot of gold because that was his legacy, was traveling with that much gold. So moving on to East Africa. East Africa was different than West Africa. They weren't empires in East Africa. Instead, they were city-states. So remember, that city that has its own government. So they govern themselves. The biggest part of East Africa was about trade. So they were kind of bringing goods from Europe and the Mediterranean into the interior, and they even traded as far as the Indian Ocean and China. That's major. Supposedly they exported a giraffe to the Chinese court, and it caused a big uproar because nobody had ever seen anything like that before. A lot of Arab traders from the Middle East do end up making their way to East Africa as well, and they're very heavily influenced in their culture by that. One city you'll hear about a lot is Zanzibar, very wealthy. Another thing that they traded, and we don't really like to talk about this because it kind of goes against our view of Africa, is they traded slaves. So they would take Africans and sell African to slave traders, to Arab slave traders. And that is part of how slaves make it back to Europe. This, again, kind of goes into some of those racist ideas as well, where a lot of historians thought that these East African city-states like Zanzibar were not built by Africans. They thought they were built by Arabs because Arabs are closer to Europeans than Africans are. So again, they're trying to deny the history of the people here who built these city-states, when in fact we know that they actually did come first. Instead, what we get is a mixture of African and Arab culture. This mixture begins to be known as Swahili. Probably most commonly know it as a language, but it's a culture as well. So Swahili comes out of this trade in East Africa. Finally, of course, we can just see a little map here where you can see the Swahili coast is. So this kind of mixes the Bantu languages with those Arabic languages that come out of the coast. So you can see that on the map in the red. And then, of course, finally, we have South Africa. So South Africa, if you look back on this map here really quickly, is below that red area there, okay? And that's from the Congo River to the Cape of Good Hope, which is the very bottom tip of Africa. And stateless is a weird kind of word Basically, just what it means is there wasn't a lot of government in these civilizations. They did trade quite a bit with East Africa, and we don't know as much about the societies of South Africa. It's harder to do some of the archaeology there. What we do know the most about is a society called Zimbabwe, or Great Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is still the name of a country there, and Zimbabwe translates into sacred house or great stone house. We're not sure exactly which one is the best, but Zimbabwe built a vast society down in southern Africa. There's a lot of evidence of great wealth there. They built massive stone buildings, which is where they get their name from. We don't know what they originally called themselves. But there's a lot of evidence of these huge societies, maybe even kings and emperors. We don't really know. We don't really know what happened with Zimbabwe, though. Most of the other civilizations fell to other African civilizations or Europeans or Arabs. But in Zimbabwe, the city seemed to be abandoned, which is why we don't know a whole lot about it, more than what archaeology can tell us. So it's kind of a big mystery in Zimbabwe. This is a photo of one of the structures that we found. You can see these massive stone walls that are around the city. Again, massive stone buildings, massive enclosures. So this just kind of gives you a good picture of what was going on in southern Africa. So there we go. That ends the show. We're going to wrap up with a crash course video, everybody's favorite. The crash course video is going to cover Mansa Musa, as well as West and East Africa, so it'll kind of reinforce some of the stuff we've been talking about. You will have an assignment after that. I miss you guys. I'm glad I could do this for you. I'll see you on Friday. Bye.